The phone rang, interrupting my vacation. Mr. Harrington, your house is on fire. It appears to be an unfortunate accident. I stood up, heart racing, sand still clinging to my feet. But 15 years in the justice system taught me there are no accidents when you've refused to pay the neighborhood's unofficial protection fee. $600 a month, demanded by people calling themselves a homeowners association. They had no legal authority, but they had lighters and arrogance. I had only one choice. Either let them erase everything my family had built, or use every skill I'd ever learned to turn this HOA into the headline of their own downfall. Comment where you're watching from, because what came next didn't just change my life, it changed the law. I never wanted to move to Oak Ridge Estates. But when my wife Laura was diagnosed with stage 3 lymphoma last spring, living 30 minutes from the best oncology center in New England suddenly became our top priority. I had spent my career ensuring justice was served, but now my family needed me more than the system did. At 48, I figured it was time for a quieter life anyway. The real estate agent seemed hesitant when I signed the papers. Oak Ridge is a lovely community, Mr. Harrington, she said with a practiced smile. Just make sure to read all the neighborhood guidelines thoroughly. I nodded absently, more concerned with how Laura would handle the stairs on her bad days than with community guidelines. When people asked what I did for a living, I usually said I was a remote software engineer. It was simpler that way. My actual position came with attention I didn't want. The moving truck had barely pulled away when a sharp knock echoed through our still empty living room. A woman with meticulously styled blonde hair and a smile that didn't reach her eyes stood on our doorstep. Barbara Whitfield, she announced, extending a manicured hand, president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. I wanted to personally welcome you to our community. Everything about her screamed control, from her perfectly pressed pantsuit to the clipboard tucked under her arm. Thank you, I said, taking her hand briefly. Michael Harrington. My wife Laura and daughter Sophia are upstairs unpacking. She pushed a thick folder into my hands. Here's your HOA registration packet. The monthly fee is $600 due on the 1st. We'll need your banking information for auto withdrawal by tomorrow. I blinked, caught off guard. I'm sorry, but my real estate agent told me this house wasn't part of any mandatory HOA. It was specifically listed as HOA exempt in my purchase contract. Barbara's smile tightened. I'm afraid your agent was mistaken. All homes in Oak Ridge Estates fall under our jurisdiction. Everyone pays. There was something in her tone, not just entitlement, but threat. I'd heard that tone before from people who were used to getting their way through intimidation. I'll need to review my paperwork, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. Barbara's eyes narrowed, and for a split second, her mask slipped. Mr. Harrington, I strongly suggest you cooperate with the HOA. Things can get difficult for homeowners who don't comply with our standards. She handed me her business card before turning on her heel. I expect your paperwork by Friday. Welcome to Oak Ridge. Over the next few days, I began meeting our neighbors. Tom Peterson, a 60-year-old retired Army veteran who lived on our left, invited me for coffee. How's the move going? He asked, pouring me a cup of strong black coffee. Fine, except for being ambushed by the HOA president on day one. Tom's friendly expression faltered. Barbara got to you already, huh? He lowered his voice. Look, I probably shouldn't say this, but be careful with her. The HOA here isn't what it seems. Before he could elaborate, his phone rang. HOA emergency meeting. Got to run. He gave me a meaningful look as he left. Check your property documents carefully, Michael, and maybe install some security cameras. That evening, I met Jessica Rodriguez from 3 houses down, who quietly warned me about Barbara. After I refused to join, strange things started happening. My garbage wasn't collected. My mail got lost. My car was keyed. She looked me directly in the eyes. Barbara's son, Tyler, works for Meridian Real Estate, the company that's been trying to buy up half the neighborhood. It's all connected somehow. The next morning, I found a violation notice taped to my door. Lawn height exceeds 2.5 inches. Fine, $150. My lawn was perfectly maintained. I'd mowed it myself yesterday. Through the window, I spotted Barbara and a younger man photographing my property. That afternoon, I visited the county records office and confirmed my suspicions. My property was indeed exempt from the HOA covenant. Barbara was bluffing and extorting money from residents who didn't know better. That night, I installed security cameras covering every angle of our property. Laura watched me worriedly. Michael, what's going on? This isn't like you. I finished mounting the last camera. Just a precaution, sweetheart. Some of the HOA policies here seem unusual. As I checked the camera feeds later, an email notification appeared from Barbara. Final notice. Your continued refusal to join the Oak Ridge HOA will result in escalating consequences. Before becoming a software engineer, I had spent years handling complex cases. A greedy HOA and a fake blonde woman with perfect acrylic nails didn't scare me. What they didn't know was that I had installed cameras all around my house from day one, and what those cameras captured that night made me call an old friend. I woke early the next morning to Sophia's scream. Racing downstairs, I found my 16-year-old daughter staring out the window, horror on her face. Our car was covered in bright red spray paint. Join HOA or leave, scrawled across both sides. Laura came up behind me, pale beneath her headscarf. Who would do something like this? She whispered. I knew exactly who, but kept my voice steady. Probably just some neighborhood kids, I lied, already checking the security footage on my phone. The night vision camera had captured everything. Tyler Whitfield and another man, faces partially obscured by hoodies, defacing our car at 3:17 in the morning. I sent the footage to my private email before showing Laura and Sophia the camera roll. See? I'm going to call the police. The responding officer was sympathetic but unhelpful. Without clear facial identification, there's not much we can do, he explained, jotting notes in his pad. Later, I learned the police chief was Barbara's brother-in-law. The local justice system was compromised. That afternoon, while Laura was at chemotherapy, I visited a real estate attorney who confirmed my property was exempt from the HOA covenant. But this pattern of harassment you're describing is concerning. These kinds of disputes can get ugly without official mediation. I returned home to find Laura at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cold mug of tea. The mothers at Sophia's school are avoiding me, she said quietly. When I went to meet her, I overheard someone say we were trouble, that we were bringing down property values. Her eyes met mine. Michael, what's really going on here? I sat beside her and told her everything. Barbara's threats, the exempt properties, Jessica's warnings, the footage. This isn't just about lawn height. Something bigger is happening, and we've become obstacles. Laura reached for my hand. Then we document everything. We build a case. That's what you've always taught Sophia, right? Stand up to bullies with facts, not fists. Later that week, Barbara held an emergency HOA meeting. Though not a member, I attended anyway, sitting quietly in the back. Barbara stood at the podium, her voice carrying. We've recently had some residents questioning the authority of this association, she announced, finding me with her gaze. Let me be clear. The Oak Ridge HOA exists to protect all our property values. Those who undermine our efforts are undermining their neighbors' investments. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Furthermore, I've received reports of a new resident with a potentially concerning background. My blood ran cold as she vaguely referenced criminal elements while repeatedly glancing my way. She was publicly insinuating I had a criminal record. We must stand united against threats to our community. After the meeting, several neighbors avoided me, hustling to their cars. Only Tom and Jessica approached. That was low, even for her, Tom muttered. She's never gone after someone's reputation before. Jessica nodded nervously. It's because you've got the documents proving your exemption. You're a threat. I watched Barbara holding court with her followers across the parking lot. I need to know exactly what she's up to. The next day, I received a notice claiming our property violated city building codes that didn't exist. The letter was printed on what appeared to be official city letterhead, but was clearly a forgery. More concerning was what I discovered examining HOA records. Penalty fees weren't going into any community fund, but directly into Barbara's personal account. That evening, Laura was in tears at the kitchen table. The hospital called. Someone tried to access my medical records, claiming to be from our insurance company. Someone was digging into our private information. That night, reviewing security footage, I saw Tyler and two men sneaking into our backyard. They destroyed my garden, Laura's one joy during treatment, and left a note stabbed into the grass. Accidents happen to people who don't listen. all captured perfectly on my cameras. I spent the next morning with a private investigator, an old contact from my previous career. The report arrived quickly. Barbara had been investigated for financial fraud in Connecticut 5 years ago. Tyler had a sealed juvenile record and worked for a real estate company actively buying properties in our neighborhood. Most importantly, the investigator uncovered a proposal to convert our entire neighborhood into a commercial complex once enough properties were acquired. "We'll see about your complaint, but I'm not making any promises," the police officer said, clearly uninterested in what he saw as a neighborly dispute. I didn't blame him. From the outside, this looked like a petty argument about grass and fences. He had no idea Barbara had just made the biggest mistake of her life. There were legal tools at my disposal that a regular software engineer wouldn't know about. When that woman threatened my wife's health, she awakened a demon she never saw coming. Within days of filing my police report, Barbara escalated her campaign against us. Flyers appeared in mailboxes throughout the neighborhood, warning residents about dangerous elements on our street. Each flyer carefully avoided naming me directly. Libel laws still applied after all, but included enough details about our house and car that everyone knew who was met. Some claimed I had a criminal past. Others insinuated I couldn't be trusted around children. Laura's condition worsened from the stress. Sophia came home from school in tears after classmates asked if her dad was really a criminal. "This has to stop," Laura insisted, her voice strained with exhaustion. "Can't we just pay the stupid fees?" "It's not worth what this is doing to our family." I held her hand, feeling the fragility of her fingers. "If we give in, they win, and they'll keep doing this to others." I didn't tell her that I'd discovered 3 other families who had been forced out of their homes through similar tactics over the past 2 years. This wasn't just about principle anymore. I implemented my first countermeasure: additional hidden cameras around our property and portable audio recorders for every interaction with HOA members. Tom helped me install them, his military precision surprisingly useful. "Been waiting years for someone to stand up to her," he admitted as we positioned a camera overlooking the back fence. "Most folks just cave or move away." When I asked why he stayed, his face darkened. "My late wife is buried in the cemetery 2 blocks from here. I'm not leaving her." Jessica provided valuable intelligence from within the community, reporting back conversations she overheard at school events and neighborhood gatherings. Barbara was telling people I was under federal investigation, that I'd lost my last job for embezzlement, that Laura's illness was just a sympathy ploy, each lie more outrageous than the last. On Tuesday, a man in an ill-fitting inspector uniform appeared at our door, claiming to be from the city building department. "Received reports of safety violations," he mumbled, trying to peer past me into the house. I recognized him immediately as one of the men from the garden vandalism footage. "I'll need to see proper identification and a warrant," I replied calmly, already recording the conversation. He flushed, made vague threats about fines, and retreated. That evening, Barbara sent a mass email to the neighborhood about imminent action against violators and protecting community standards. The next day, our garbage wasn't collected. The day after, our mail arrived water damaged. Then Laura's car window was smashed in the hospital parking lot. No witnesses, of course. No usable security footage. Just another unfortunate incident in a growing string of harassment. I needed to understand the full scope of the HOA's financial operations. So I set my sights on Douglas Henderson, a 62-year-old retired accountant who served as the HOA treasurer. Unlike Barbara's inner circle of sycophants, Douglas had always seemed uncomfortable during confrontations at meetings. After accidentally bumping into him at the local coffee shop, I struck up a conversation about retirement investments, a topic I knew would interest a former accountant. An hour later, after discussions ranging from stock portfolios to his grandchildren, I carefully steered the conversation toward the HOA. "Must be challenging managing the finances for the whole community," I observed casually. Douglas's expression shifted subtly. "It's more complicated than people realize," he admitted, lowering his voice. "Barbara has her own way of handling things." He glanced at his watch nervously. "I should go." As he gathered his things, I slid my card across the table. "If you ever need to talk about those complications, I'm a good listener." The situation at Sophia's school deteriorated rapidly. During lunch period, a group of students publicly humiliated her, chanting "criminal's kid," until a teacher intervened. The principal called me, his tone apologetic but firm. "We can't control rumors in the community, Mr. Harrington." That same afternoon, Laura received an official-looking letter from the city planning department, another forgery, claiming our house violated multiple ordinances and faced potential foreclosure. The shock triggered a panic attack that sent her back to the hospital. Standing beside her bed that night, watching machines monitor her weakened heart, something hardened inside me. This had gone beyond neighborhood politics. They were endangering my family's lives. It was time to stop playing defense. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock on Thursday evening. I arrived early, sitting prominently in the front row, a thick binder of documents beside me. Barbara faltered momentarily when she saw me, but quickly recovered, launching into her usual agenda of community complaints and financial reports. When she opened the floor for questions, I stood immediately. "I'd like to review the HOA financial statements for the past 3 years," I announced, my voice carrying through the suddenly silent room. "Specifically, I'm interested in tracking where the violation fees and penalties have been allocated." Barbara's smile froze. "Those records are private to the board." I opened my binder, removing a printed copy of the HOA bylaws. Actually, Section 7, Paragraph 3 states that all financial records must be made available to community members upon request. I'm making that request now. A murmur rippled through the audience. Barbara's face flushed crimson. "This meeting is not the appropriate venue. If you wish to review records, you can schedule an appointment with our treasurer." All eyes turned to Douglas, who sat stiffly at the side table, his gaze fixed on his folded hands. "That would be irregular," he managed. Barbara quickly adjourned the meeting, but not before I noticed several residents looking at her with new suspicion. Later that night, a knock at my home office door startled me. Douglas Henderson stood on my porch, looking over his shoulder anxiously. "We need to talk," he whispered, "but not here. I have copies of the financial records for the past 5 years. It's worse than you think." He handed me a flash drive. "Barbara's been siphoning HOA funds into personal accounts since she took over. Tyler's company gets all the maintenance contracts at inflated prices. They've been using violation fees to fund their real estate purchases." He swallowed hard. "I've known for months, but I was too afraid to come forward. They threatened my daughter's job at the hospital when I questioned an expense last year." The office door closed behind Douglas when my phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. "Need to talk urgently about Barbara. I have information you need." I looked out the window, spotting a camera flash from a car parked across the street. Someone was watching me, but they didn't know I had a plan that years in the justice system had taught me how to execute. Barbara wanted to play dirty? Fine, but I knew how to play by the rules to get the best results. Over the next week, I secretly met with 5 other families who had experienced HOA harassment, but were too frightened to speak out. In Tom's basement, away from prying eyes and potential listening devices, I recorded their testimonies. Unauthorized fines, threatening letters, property damage, all following the same pattern. Each family had either eventually paid the illegal HOA fees or sold their homes at below-market prices to Tyler's real estate company. "She threatened to call child services when I questioned the fees," whispered a young mother, clutching her husband's hand. "Said they'd received reports about our parenting." An elderly man nodded grimly. "They cut off my sprinkler system during the hottest week of summer, killed my entire garden, then fined me for landscape neglect." I compiled their statements, adding them to my growing file of evidence. Meanwhile, Barbara and Tyler realized I was actively investigating them. Their tactics shifted from intimidation to more direct action. One evening, a man wearing a poorly mocked-up police uniform appeared at our door, claiming to have a warrant regarding neighborhood disturbances. When I demanded to see his badge number and proper identification, he quickly retreated to a waiting car. The same car I had spotted watching my house earlier. The following day, our electricity mysteriously failed despite no outages reported in the area. When the utility company investigated, they found our external fuse box had been tampered with. Most disturbing was when Laura was confronted directly by Barbara while walking home from her treatment session. "Your husband is making powerful enemies," Barbara had told her, standing too close for comfort. "Accidents happen every day to people who don't know their place." I needed to understand the full scope of what we were facing, So I approached Christine Weber, an investigative reporter for the local newspaper. I'm not looking for a story yet, I explained over coffee at a diner 20 miles from our neighborhood. Just information. Christine had recently published a series on development corruption in neighboring counties. Meridian Real Estate, she mused, scrolling through her notes. They've been buying up properties all through this region. Word is they're fronting for Capital Core Development, which has plans for a massive commercial complex, but they need contiguous properties to make it work. She eyed me carefully. If what you're saying is true, this HOA president isn't just running a petty extortion scheme. She's facilitating a multi-million-dollar land grab. The next piece of the puzzle fell into place when Douglas secretly provided me with copies of suspicious HOA financial transactions. Barbara maintains 2 sets of books, he explained, his hands shaking as he passed me the flash drive. The official one shows normal community expenses. The shadow accounting shows where the money really goes. The documents revealed over $1.5 million in homeowner fees had been diverted to personal accounts and suspicious consulting payments to shell companies owned by Tyler. Hours after our meeting, Douglas called in a panic. Barbara knows I talked to you. She came to my house, threatened to reveal some mistakes in my past. I have to resign from the treasurer position. I'm sorry. I assured him he'd done the right thing and promised to keep him out of any further involvement. The trap was closing, but not fast enough. The situation reached a breaking point when I received an urgent call from Sophia's school. She had collapsed during gym class, unresponsive and pale. At the hospital, the doctor pulled me aside, his expression grave. We found traces of a stimulant in her system. Not recreational drugs, something prescription strength. Has she been taking any medications? My blood ran cold. Sophia didn't take any medication. Someone had deliberately drugged my 16-year-old daughter. With the school principal's reluctant permission, I reviewed the security footage from the cafeteria that day. The images were grainy but clear enough. Brenda Wilson, HOA board member and cafeteria worker, lingering near Sophia's unattended water bottle during lunch period. I watched as she glanced around before leaning over the table, her hand moving quickly above the bottle. I'd had enough. That evening, I contacted James Reynolds, an old colleague from my days in the justice system. I need unofficial guidance, I explained, sending him the evidence I'd compiled. The local authorities are compromised. James was silent as he reviewed the files, his expression darkening with each document. Michael, this goes beyond HOA overreach, he finally said. You've got evidence of mail fraud, financial fraud, property damage, and now assault of a minor. This needs federal attention. He hesitated. But they'll need more than what you have. They'll need clear evidence of intent and coordination. I nodded, understanding what he wasn't saying explicitly. We needed to catch them in the act, admitting to their crimes. I can make that happen, I assured him. Just tell me what we need for an airtight case. While Laura stayed with Sophia at the hospital, I set up the final phase of my plan. I carefully planted a small recording device in a decorative plant. A peace offering I delivered to Barbara's home with an apologetic note suggesting we work things out as neighbors. That evening, as I suspected they would, Barbara convened an emergency meeting with Tyler and key HOA board members in her living room. Through the listening device, I heard their entire conversation. We need him gone, or at least his house. Barbara's voice came through clearly. If there's a fire, insurance will cover it, and he'll have to leave. My heart pounded. They were literally plotting to burn down my house. I looked down at the file on my desk, the evidence I'd gathered over many weeks. It was time to call the number I'd been holding back from using. The warning from my friend in law enforcement about the arson plot gave me precious little time to prepare. That night I moved Laura and Sophia to a hotel under a different name, telling them it was for a weekend getaway to recover from recent stress. Then I installed additional cameras and a sophisticated fire alarm system connected directly to the fire department. I knew from my investigation that the HOA had misappropriated over $1.5 million in residents' contributions for personal investments and luxurious spending. Barbara's taste for designer clothes and Tyler's new sports car suddenly made sense. The paper trail Douglas had provided showed clearly how they'd been operating their scheme for years, but I needed them to take action that couldn't be explained away as a misunderstanding. My opportunity came sooner than expected. I deliberately spread word through Tom that I would be away on a business trip for 2 days. In reality, I was monitoring my home security system from a motel just 3 miles away. At approximately 2:15 in the morning on the second night, my phone alerted me to motion on the property. Through the live feed, I watched as Tyler and two men in dark clothing approached my house. They carried gas cans and moved with disturbing confidence, as if they'd done this before. They broke into my garage through a side window, splashed gasoline throughout the space and along the exterior wall of the first floor, then lit a match. The flames erupted immediately, engulfing the garage door in minutes. My automatic fire suppression system activated, and I simultaneously called 911, watching the entire scenario unfold through my phone. By the time I arrived at my property, fire trucks and police cars surrounded the house. The blaze had been contained primarily to the garage and a portion of the first floor, though smoke and water damage extended throughout the structure. As I stood staring at the wreckage, a familiar voice spoke beside me. "Such a terrible accident," Barbara said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. She had arrived suspiciously quickly for the middle of the night. This is what happens when homes aren't maintained to proper standards. If you'd been part of the HOA, our regular safety inspections might have prevented this electrical fire. I turned to look at her, amazed by her audacity. Nearby, Tyler hung back, watching the firefighters work with an expression that mixed satisfaction with feigned concern. "Electrical fire?" I repeated. "That's interesting, since the fire chief hasn't determined the cause yet." Barbara's smile didn't waver. "Just an assumption. These older homes often have wiring issues." She patted my arm condescendingly. "Your insurance should cover it, but if you're thinking of selling rather than rebuilding, Tyler's company would be happy to make you an offer. Something quick and simple given the circumstances." The local police took perfunctory statements but showed little interest in investigating thoroughly. The officer in charge, who I later learned played golf weekly with the police chief and Barbara's husband, seemed eager to write it off as an accidental fire. "No evidence of foul play," he concluded after barely 10 minutes on site. "Probably an electrical short, or maybe something left plugged in." I nodded meekly, playing the role of the devastated homeowner too shocked to argue. Let them think they'd won. Over the next few days, I maintained the pretense of defeated resignation. I stayed at the hotel with Laura and Sophia, making occasional appearances at the damaged house to salvage belongings while slumping my shoulders and avoiding eye contact with neighbors. Barbara circulated triumphantly through the neighborhood, her victory lap barely disguised as checking on community concerns. Jessica called me in tears one evening. "Tyler and his friends came to my house today," she whispered. "They said with your house gone, mine was next unless I sold to them. They know exactly how much I owe on my mortgage, Michael. They offered $40,000 below market value and said I should consider myself lucky." Her voice cracked. "They said no one would want to buy in a neighborhood with random house fires anyway." The pieces were falling into place. While publicly playing the role of the broken man, I secretly met with federal law enforcement officials, providing them with extensive evidence. Financial documents showing fraud, testimony from residents who had been victimized, and most damning of all, clear video footage of the arson attempt. I carefully revealed aspects of my professional background that I had kept private until now. My extensive experience with the justice system, my knowledge of building complex cases, and my connections within federal agencies. The agents were particularly interested in the real estate angle. "This crosses state lines," one noted, reviewing the documents. "The development company is registered in Delaware. The properties are in Massachusetts, and the financing appears to flow through accounts in New York and Connecticut. That gives us jurisdiction." The FBI began a formal investigation, but cautioned me to be patient. "Building a case this comprehensive takes time," the lead agent explained. "We need to connect all the dots between the HOA fraud, the real estate scheme, and the pattern of intimidation. We don't want just Barbara and Tyler. We want everyone involved, including the development company executives." I agreed to continue my charade of defeat while they worked behind the scenes. Meanwhile, Barbara called an emergency HOA meeting to address the tragic fire and ongoing community safety concerns. Standing at the podium, she announced with barely concealed satisfaction that I was considering selling my damaged home and moving away. Sometimes it takes a wake-up call for people to realize they're not a good fit for a community with our standards, she concluded to murmurs of agreement from her loyal supporters. Are you sure you want to continue? The agent asked me. They could become more dangerous. I looked at the family photo on my desk. Laura in the hospital after her panic attack, Sophia still haunted by the poisoning incident. I've spent my entire life ensuring justice is served, I said carefully, choosing my words. And this isn't the time to stop. I opened my laptop, accessing a system that not everyone had permission to access. It was time to use tools I had been restraining myself from using until now. With the investigation progressing behind the scenes, I needed to shore up my allies within the neighborhood. I discreetly revealed part of my professional legal background to Tom and Jessica, explaining why I had the knowledge and resources to fight back effectively against the HOA. I've worked within the justice system for most of my career, I told them during a private meeting at a diner 20 miles from Oak Ridge. My experience gives me certain advantages in gathering evidence and building a case. Tom nodded approvingly. I knew you weren't just a software guy. The way you documented everything from day one, that's not average homeowner behavior. Jessica seemed relieved. So there's actually a chance we could stop them for real? I outlined what they could do to help without putting themselves at risk, emphasizing that the authorities were now involved, though the investigation needed to remain confidential. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies expanded their investigation, discovering that Barbara and Tyler were connected to similar real estate fraud schemes in 3 other states. Their pattern was consistent: infiltrate a neighborhood through the HOA, harass homeowners who wouldn't sell, damage property values through selective enforcement, then buy properties at deflated prices for the development company. What made this case particularly egregious was the escalation to arson and the drugging of a minor. I cited urgent work matters as my reason for being absent from the neighborhood for several days, letting Barbara believe I had given up the fight and was focusing on my job while figuring out what to do about the house. Her smug messages about community cleanup initiatives targeting my damaged property continued to arrive by email. Barbara heard news reports about a major corruption case being investigated, but didn't connect it to her situation. Tyler, however, grew increasingly nervous as rumors of federal agents asking questions spread through the real estate community. He began attempting to erase evidence, deleting emails and pressuring Douglas to remain silent about the financial irregularities. He came to my house at 11 at night, Douglas told me during a furtive meeting at a highway rest stop. Said if I talked to anyone about the HOA accounts, he'd make sure I had an accident. Like that software engineer, he said. He was drunk and scared, Michael. These people are unraveling. I reassured Douglas that his testimony was protected and gave him a contact number for the federal agent handling the case. The final phase of my plan began with a seemingly defeated phone call to Barbara. I'm considering your suggestion, I told her, my voice deliberately tired and resigned. After everything that's happened, rebuilding just seems overwhelming. Laura's health can't take the stress. Barbara's triumphant tone barely concealed her excitement. I think that's a wise decision, Michael. Tyler's company can offer you a fair price despite the fire damage. Why don't we meet at Greenwood legal offices tomorrow to discuss terms? They're a neutral third party who can facilitate the paperwork. Of course, Greenwood Legal was anything but neutral. They handled all of Meridian Real Estate's transactions. What Barbara didn't know was that I had already spoken with federal agents about using this meeting as an opportunity to gather final conclusive evidence. The next morning, I arrived at the modest office building, looking appropriately dejected. Barbara greeted me with a predatory smile, Tyler standing smugly beside her. Attorney James Greenwood, who I knew from my research was also on Meridian's payroll, laid out paperwork offering roughly 60% of my home's pre-fire value. Given the extensive damage and the difficulties you've experienced in the neighborhood, this is quite generous, Barbara explained, her tone condescending. We're even willing to handle the insurance complications. Encouraged by what she perceived as my surrender, Barbara grew increasingly bold as our conversation continued. The HOA has certain standards, Michael. Some people just aren't community-minded enough to appreciate our vision for Oak Ridge. Tyler nodded. Sometimes people need a little push to make the right decision for everyone. I looked at the insulting offer on the table, then back at Barbara's triumphant expression. Just to be clear, I said slowly, this offer is contingent on me dropping any claims about harassment or property damage? Barbara waved her hand dismissively. Water under the bridge. Accidents happen in every neighborhood. Her emphasis on accidents hung in the air. Like the fire? I asked innocently. Barbara's smile tightened. Electrical problems are so common in older homes. I nodded thoughtfully. And my daughter's sudden illness? Tyler shifted uncomfortably, but Barbara remained confident. Children get sick. Surely you're not suggesting anyone in our community would harm a child. The recording device hidden in my briefcase and jacket button captured every word. Actually, I said, straightening in my chair, that's exactly what I'm suggesting. I pressed a button on my phone, and the office door opened. 3 federal agents entered, badges displayed. Barbara Whitfield and Tyler Whitfield were here to discuss the ongoing federal investigation into fraud, extortion, and attempted arson. Barbara's face drained of color. This is absurd. We're having a private real estate discussion. The lead agent placed a file on the table. We have extensive evidence of a pattern of racketeering across multiple states, Mrs. Whitfield, including video footage of your son setting fire to Mr. Harrington's home. Tyler stood abruptly. Mom, don't say anything else. We need a lawyer. Barbara's shock turned to fury as she glared at me. Who the hell are you, really? The agent beside me answered for me. Mrs. Whitfield, you've been attempting to extort and intimidate federal judge Michael Harrington. The room fell silent as Barbara's jaw literally dropped. Judge Harrington has been cooperating with our investigation while gathering evidence of your criminal enterprise. The color drained from Tyler's face as he collapsed back into his chair. The attorney began stammering about misunderstandings and lack of personal involvement. Barbara switched tactics instantly, claiming she knew nothing about Tyler's independent actions and was shocked and appalled by any criminal behavior. Their desperate attempts at denial were captured perfectly for the official record. Within hours, Barbara, Tyler, and 6 other co-conspirators, including the corrupt police chief and 2 other HOA board members, were in federal custody, facing charges ranging from mail fraud and extortion to attempted murder. I called a community meeting at the local school auditorium, finally revealing my true identity to the entire neighborhood. For those who don't know me yet, I'm Michael Harrington, I began, addressing the packed room of confused and curious neighbors. While I've been working remotely as a software consultant since moving here, my primary career for the past 15 years has been as a federal judge, specializing in cases involving corruption and organized crime. A murmur of astonishment rippled through the crowd. When my family needed to relocate closer to my wife's cancer treatment facility, I chose to keep my position private for our safety and privacy. I never expected that decision would lead to uncovering one of the most elaborate real estate fraud schemes I've encountered in my judicial career. Judge Harrington, are you concerned about similar cases nationwide? A reporter asked as I left the courthouse. I paused, looking directly into the camera. This isn't about me or my family anymore. This is about thousands of families being bullied and defrauded by corrupt HOAs. I had no idea that statement would make my phone ring continuously throughout the night with calls from across the country, and one special call from the White House itself. The trial of Barbara Whitfield, Tyler Whitfield, and their co-conspirators became a media sensation. As the victim and primary witness, rather than the presiding judge, I took the stand to detail the months of harassment, intimidation, and escalating violence my family had endured. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Financial records showing millions in misappropriated HOA funds, video footage of the arson attempt, testimony from dozens of victimized homeowners, and recordings of Barbara and Tyler's own incriminating statements. National news crews camped outside the courthouse daily, transforming what might have been a local corruption case into a symbol of HOA abuse across America. This isn't just about one neighborhood in Massachusetts, the lead prosecutor explained to reporters. This case has exposed a pattern that's playing out in suburbs nationwide, HOAs being weaponized for profit at homeowners' expense. Barbara's courtroom strategy was predictable but ineffective. She portrayed herself as an unwitting victim, claiming Tyler and the development company had manipulated her. I was just trying to maintain community standards, she insisted tearfully on the stand. I had no idea what they were really doing. Her performance might have been convincing if not for the mountain of evidence showing her as the mastermind, including emails where she explicitly outlined their intimidation tactics. Tyler, facing potentially longer sentencing, quickly turned on his mother. It was her idea from the beginning, he testified as part of his plea agreement. She approached Meridian Development about buying out the neighborhood 3 years ago. She said she knew how to convince reluctant homeowners to sell. His testimony revealed similar schemes they had executed in Connecticut and New Hampshire, forcing out dozens of families through systematic harassment. Douglas took the stand despite his obvious terror, detailing years of financial manipulation. Mrs. Whitfield maintained two separate accounting systems, he explained, voice trembling. The official books showed normal HOA operations, while the actual funds were diverted to personal accounts and shell companies. Yeah. When asked why he hadn't reported this sooner, his answer resonated with many in the courtroom. She knew where my grandchildren went to school. She had pictures of my daughter leaving work. When someone has that much control over your community, you convince yourself it's easier to look the other way. Other residents shared similar stories. How Barbara had used personal information against them. How small acts of resistance were met with escalating consequences. How they had lived in constant fear for years. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Barbara received 23 years in federal prison for racketeering, fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder. Tyler, with his cooperation agreement, still faced 12 years. Their real estate partners and other co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. As Barbara was led away in handcuffs, she looked back at me with pure hatred. I felt no satisfaction in that moment, only relief that she could no longer harm my family or anyone else's. The judge awarded substantial damages to all affected homeowners, to be paid from the seized assets of the development company and Barbara's hidden accounts. More importantly, the case sparked a Senate Special Committee on HOA reform, with me invited to help draft new legislation to prevent similar abuses nationwide. Laura completed her final treatment 2 months after the trial concluded, her oncologist cautiously optimistic about her prognosis. The stress certainly didn't help her recovery, he told me privately, but she's remarkably resilient. Sophia gradually recovered from her traumatic experience, though she continued working with a therapist to process the violation of being drugged at school. Our neighborhood began a slow healing process as well. With Barbara's corrupt HOA dissolved, residents held elections for a new, transparent homeowners association. Tom was unanimously elected president, with Jessica as treasurer. Their first act was to reduce monthly dues by 70% and establish clear written policies that required resident approval for any changes. 6 months after the trial, I received an unexpected phone call from the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. "We've had our eye on you for some time, Michael," he said. "Your handling of the Harrison corruption case last year was exemplary, and now this. Your unique perspective on how corruption affects ordinary citizens would be invaluable at a higher level." The offer to consider a Supreme Court nomination was tempting, but after discussing it with Laura and Sophia, I declined. "My family has been through enough," I explained. "Right now, they need stability more than they need the honor of my advancement." Instead, I accepted a position heading the newly formed Judicial Committee on Community Governance, which would allow me to address HOA abuses nationwide while maintaining our home. 1 year after the fire, our house finally restored and improved. We hosted a large barbecue for the entire neighborhood. Children played on the lawn where threatening notes had once been staked. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now chatted comfortably on our porch. Tom raised a glass for a toast. To Judge Harrington, who taught us that standing up to bullies isn't just for schoolyards. Everyone laughed, but Laura squeezed my hand, knowing how close we'd come to losing everything. Later that evening, as the last guest departed and we cleaned up the backyard, a young couple approached me somewhat hesitantly. "We're moving into the Henderson place next week," the woman explained. "People keep telling us we're lucky to be joining this community now, but no one will say exactly why. What happened here?" "Sometimes justice doesn't come from courtrooms or law enforcement," I replied. "Sometimes it begins with one ordinary person brave enough to say no to injustice." Barbara thought she could intimidate a timid software engineer, but instead confronted a federal judge. However, the most important lesson I learned was this. We don't need to be judges to fight for justice. My house still stands, and whenever I see new neighbors moving in, I just smile and say, "Welcome to the neighborhood where no one burns down your house just because you refuse to join the HOA." Thanks for riding the emotional roller coaster with HOA Unleashed. Buckle up, the next one's even twistier.